It took me 10 years to write Four Tokens. And during that time, I had two children. My dad died, my nephew died, and for various reasons, I felt like my sense of self was sort of shattered, and I had to rebuild my ability to make poems from scratch. And this book is deeply connected with my first Loop of Jade in ways that I only came to realize in the late stages of writing it. They stand almost like they're holding hands with one another. And this one, reading it, I think changes the experience of reading the first and vice versa. I had this experience you sometimes have, I think, when children are born, of your relationship to time changing, and you suddenly become very preoccupied with trying to peer into the future, but you also find yourself looking back on the past with fresh eyes. And I found myself revisiting various things, my own childhood, my relationship with my mother, and trying to make sense of maybe the discrepancies that I found emerging between my sense of how that had once been and the truth that began to emerge when I dug beneath the surface. The title, Four Tokens, is not something I can take credit for, actually. That was a stroke that came from my own editor, Parissa Ibrahimi. I had various much inferior working titles through most of the writing of this book. And when she suddenly suggested that word, I think it clicked into place for me. So Four Tokens, it's an archaic word. It means signs or omens of what's to come. And I pilfered it out of a text that was written sometime around 1580 by the Elizabethan poet Philip Sidney. And he wrote a text called The Defence of Poesy, which basically seeks to set out the stall of why poetry matters, and why it can be a force for good in the world and can change people for the better. And I found myself conducting a bit of an act of divination with this text. So I found myself opening it at random and copying out words or phrases that caught my eye. And I built the title poem of the book that way. But I think the idea of divination or augury or peering into the future is quite an important one in the book. And it also reaches back to my first collection, Loop of Jade, where the title poem in that book features my grandmother, my mum's adoptive mum, when I was born, going to the temple in Hong Kong and shaking out these fortune-telling sticks. And the way that form of Chinese divination works is you use these sticks to go back to a text that tells you the baby's future. So it's sort of a call and response back to that moment, really. I think in the later stages of writing the book, the metaphors, the sort of celestial metaphors of sun and moon and stars, I started to notice the way that they were cropping up in lots of different poems, including one strand that thinks about black holes and time and the sort of paradoxes of space-time, inspired by Stephen Hawking. But I started to think about those metaphors of dark and light almost as an organizing principle in the book, that I felt like I'd been trying to write poems that in some ways are more direct and more unguarded than I'd ever written before. And I enjoyed the way that those poems seemed to sort of walk in the sunlight. But then I started to feel like the book was opening too much of itself too swiftly. So I felt like there needed to be this counterbalancing force. And I thought of those as my sort of moonlight poems. So I wrote a whole swathe of poems that give up their sense less readily. And I felt like there needed to be an interplay between the two, really. I feel like there's still a thread of connection with the self that wrote my first book. But I also feel like there's much more emotional complication and maybe even conflict in these poems that I think, in particular, my first book looked at my mum and the sufferings that she experienced in her early life and recounted them, but almost with an air of hagiography, as it were. Whereas I had the experience of going back and living with my parents in their house when our first child was born, which in some ways was a wonderful experience and in other ways quite a tense one. And I think that warts and all feeling does come through in this book, which I think is happier to live with mess and imperfection and unpolishedness. I actually found myself stopping my hand from overly finishing things because I wanted there to be a slight raggedness to some of these. They're baggier, rangier poems. It's lovely to be nominated for the prize. I mean, 10 years after winning it before, a prize that I never imagined I could possibly win and that I shouldn't probably have won. That 10 years has seen a few wobbles in my sense of myself as a writer and my confidence. So being on this shortlist with such wonderful fellow poets, it means a lot, actually.